Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into something that will make your worst roommate's bathroom habits seem absolutely pristine. We're exploring the personal hygiene of Queen Elizabeth I, where spring cleaning meant changing your underwear once a season, dental care involved rubbing your teeth with honey and sugar, and a monthly bath was considered dangerously excessive self-indulgence. From lead-based makeup that literally ate away at her face to perfumes strong enough to knock out a horse, the Virgin Queen's beauty routine was part chemistry experiment, part medieval torture, and entirely dependent on how many layers of powder could hide the smell of royal decay. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It's 1588, and England trembles on the edge of greatness. The Spanish Armada darkens the horizon like storm clouds, but Elizabeth stands resolute on the cliffs of Dover, her white horse prancing, her armour gleaming, her voice carrying across the assembled troops like thunder. "I have the heart and stomach of a king," she declares, "and of a king of England too." What she doesn't mention, what history politely omits, is that beneath that shining breastplate, wrapped in layers of silk and steel, is a body that hasn't seen a proper bath. Well, let's just say the Spanish aren't the only thing that stinks in this scenario. Let's begin where all earthly matters must, with the most basic of human needs. Even queens, you see, must answer nature's call, and in Tudor England, nature called back with the approximate subtlety of a town crier announcing plague deaths. Elizabeth's throne behind the throne is her close stool, a padded wooden chair with a chamber pot, nestled beneath like a secret scandal. This isn't your grandfather's toilet, mind you. This is a piece of furniture worthy of royal buttocks, velvet-lined, silk-cushioned, and perfumed with enough rose water to drown a small spaniel. The groom of the stool, despite the rather undignified title, holds one of the most trusted positions in the royal household. They are privy, if you'll forgive the pun, to the Queen's most vulnerable moments. More than once, matters of state have been discussed over the gentle tinkle of royal relief. Treaties signed, marriages arranged, executions ordered, all while Elizabeth sits in contemplative comfort above her porcelain chamber. But here's where things get aromatic. That chamber pot, once filled, must go somewhere. And somewhere in Tudor England is a fascinatingly loose concept. The royal palaces of Whitehall, Greenwich, and Richmond are architectural marvels, true enough. Soaring ceilings, intricate tapestries, gold leaf that catches candlelight like captured sunbeams. But beneath all that grandeur runs a network of guardrobes, essentially vertical shafts, that function as the world's most inefficient sewage system. Picture, if you will, a narrow stone chute running down the exterior walls of the palace. At the top, a wooden seat. At the bottom, hopefully, the River Thames. In between, several floors worth of royal and noble refuse, aging like wine but considerably less pleasant. These guardrobes are cleaned, occasionally, when the smell becomes truly unbearable, when foreign dignitaries start asking pointed questions about the unique atmospheric qualities of English palaces, when even the rats begin to complain. The unfortunate souls tasked with this Herculean duty are known as gong farmers, a euphemism that fools absolutely no one. They work at night, by candlelight, armed with long-handled ladles, and the kind of dedication that only extreme poverty can inspire. Many suffer respiratory ailments. Some fall into the very pits they're meant to clean. A few simply disappear, whether through accident or the entirely understandable desire to flee to a profession with better working conditions. Elizabeth, ever conscious of her divine image, prefers her personal close stool to these communal facilities. Can you blame her? The guardrobes reek of centuries of use, their stone walls stained with substances best left unidentified. Better to maintain the illusion of royal perfection, even if it means her personal chamber pot must be emptied 6 times daily by trembling servants who've learned to breathe through their mouths. But the challenge isn't merely disposal, it's concealment. Elizabeth cannot be seen in any state that suggests mortality, let alone digestive function. Her attendants become masters of choreography, timing her bathroom breaks between audiences disguising the groom of the stool's comings and goings, ensuring that the royal chambers always smell of roses rather than, well, anything else. The close stool itself becomes a symbol of sorts. Portable, private, perfumed, much like Elizabeth's entire approach to governance. She controls access, manages perception, and ensures that even her most basic human functions serve the greater mythology of the Virgin Queen. Still, there are cracks in this carefully constructed facade. Visiting diplomats occasionally notice the quick shuffle of servants carrying covered vessels. Court gossips whisper about the unusual frequency of private prayers in the royal chambers. A few brave souls even dare to comment on the interesting mingling of scents that seems to follow the Queen's presence. But these observations are quickly forgotten, or rather, forced to be forgotten, because in Elizabeth's England, to acknowledge the Queen's humanity is to undermine her divinity. And that, dear listeners, is a treasonous thought. So the royal waste flows on, down guardrobes and into rivers, carrying with it the secrets of state and the byproducts of sovereignty. The Queen sits on her throne, both literal and metaphorical, ruling an empire while her chamber pot waits patiently below. And if the Spanish Armada could smell what's really happening in English palaces, they might have turned around and sailed straight home. Now let's address the elephant in the room, or perhaps more accurately, the unwashed Queen in the chamber. Elizabeth's bathing habits, or rather her steadfast avoidance thereof, become the stuff of legend, but to understand her aversion to water, we must first understand the prevailing medical wisdom of the age, which was roughly as sound as a ship made of parchment. Tudor physicians, learned men with impressive beards and questionable theories, believed wholeheartedly that water, particularly hot water, could kill you, not metaphorically, literally, dead as a doornail, deceased as a parrot, pushing up the proverbial daisies. The logic, such as it was, centered on the theory of humours. Every human body contained 4 essential fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Good health required these humours to remain in perfect balance. Hot water, the doctors insisted, opened the pores, allowing miasmas, poisonous airs to seep into the body and wreak absolute havoc. Better to stay dry, they reasoned, than risk letting the Black Death waltz through your epidermis. Elizabeth, being no fool despite her questionable hygiene choices, adopts a compromise position. She will bathe, but only when absolutely necessary, and only under the most controlled circumstances possible. The result, the famous monthly bath, scheduled with the precision of a military campaign and approached with all the enthusiasm of a root canal. Picture the scene: a great wooden tub, hauled into the Queen's private chambers by 6 sweating servants who've been sworn to secrecy, on pain of having their tongues removed. The tub is lined with the finest linen, not for comfort, mind you, but to protect royal skin from splinters and the natural oils of the wood that might, according to medical theory, corrupt the royal humours. Water is heated in copper kettles over roaring fires, then carried bucket by bucket up stone stairs by servants who've clearly drawn the short straw in life's lottery. The temperature is tested obsessively. Too hot might cook the Queen like a Christmas goose. Too cold might shock her delicate system into complete shutdown. Herbs are added: rosemary for purification, thyme for courage, lavender for its allegedly protective properties. The water takes on a murky green tinge that's probably more appetizing than whatever's cooking in the palace kitchens. Elizabeth enters this steaming cauldron with all the enthusiasm of a cat approaching a dog groomer. She's surrounded by ladies-in-waiting who flutter about like nervous moths, ready to catch her should she faint from the shock of actual cleanliness. Towels are heated by the fire, screens are arranged to protect her from drafts, which are also believed capable of causing immediate death. The bath itself is mercifully brief. Elizabeth soaks for perhaps 10 minutes, just long enough to satisfy the minimal requirements of royal hygiene, while not risking the complete collapse of her immune system. She's towelled off quickly, dusted with scented powders, and wrapped in heated robes as if she's just survived a harrowing ordeal, which, by the medical standards of the day, she has. No soap is used during these monthly ablutions. Tudor soap is lye-based, harsh enough to strip paint, and strong enough to dissolve skin. Instead, the Queen relies on the herbs in her bath water and the gentle action of warm water to achieve what passes for cleanliness. The bath water, precious and expensively heated, is not wasted. It's reused by lower-ranking ladies of the court, passed down the social hierarchy like a particularly unsanitary heirloom. By the time it reaches the scullery maids, it's achieved a consistency and colour that would challenge even the most creative chef. Between these monthly adventures in aquatic terror, Elizabeth maintains her person through what can generously be called spot cleaning. Basins of scented water for hands and face, vinegar rinses for particularly stubborn grime, pumice stones for calluses that threaten to breach the boundaries of royal perfection. But the cornerstone of her hygiene routine is linen. Fresh, clean, frequently changed linen undergarments that serve as a barrier between her royal person and the outer world. These shifts, chemises and stockings are washed daily in huge copper vats, boiled with strong soap, and dried in palace courtyards where they flutter like white flags of surrender to basic sanitation. The theory is sound, if incomplete. Clean linen against the skin absorbs sweat, oils, and other bodily secretions. Change the linen frequently enough, and you maintain an acceptable level of cleanliness without risking the mortal perils of actual bathing. It works, sort of. Elizabeth's contemporaries describe her as remarkably clean for the era. Foreign ambassadors, admittedly working with severely lowered expectations, comment favourably on her presentation. The common people, who might bathe twice a year whether they need to or not, view her monthly ablutions as evidence of almost supernatural dedication to purity. But the cracks in this system begin to show as Elizabeth ages. The monthly baths become increasingly theatrical, more ritual than cleaning. The herbs grow stronger, the perfumes heavier, the intervals between baths longer. By her 60s, some whisper that the Queen has abandoned bathing altogether, relying entirely on powder, paint, and increasingly desperate applications of rosewater. Still, she maintains the myth. Her portraits show a woman eternally young, eternally fresh, eternally untouched by the mortal concerns of sweat and grime. Artists are instructed to paint her as she wishes to be remembered, not as she necessarily appears. The gap between image and reality grows wider with each passing year. But on those rare occasions when she does submit to the monthly ordeal of bathing, Elizabeth emerges from her wooden tub like Venus from the waves. If Venus had been thoroughly powdered, perfumed, and wrapped in enough scented linen to outfit a small convent. The servants dispose of the bathwater discreetly, usually under cover of darkness. The tub is scrubbed, dried, and stored away until the next monthly battle between royal hygiene and royal vanity. And Elizabeth, clean for perhaps the only time in 30 days, retreats to her chambers to begin the slow, inexorable process of becoming fragrant once again. Beneath the towering red gold curls that have inspired 1,000 portraits lies a secret more closely guarded than state treasures. Elizabeth's scalp is not a queenly sanctuary, but a thriving metropolis of uninvited guests. Yes, we're talking about lice, those persistent, democratic little creatures that recognize neither royal blood nor divine right. Head lice in the 16th century are not the occasional embarrassment they are today. They are permanent residents, paying no rent and requiring no invitation. From the lowest scullery maid to the highest duke, everyone shares their living space with these tiny tenants. The only variable is how well one hides the fact. Elizabeth's relationship with her hair begins promisingly enough. In her youth, she sports the vibrant red gold locks inherited from her father, Henry VIII, hair that catches candlelight like spun copper and frames her pale face with fiery authority. But age, stress, and an increasingly toxic beauty regimen take their toll. By her 30s, her natural hair begins to thin. By her 40s, it's retreating faster than the Spanish Armada. Enter the wig, that miraculous invention that allows Elizabeth to maintain the illusion of eternal youth while providing a convenient hiding place for her scalp's unwelcome inhabitants. Her wig makers, perhaps the most trusted artisans in her employ, craft elaborate confections of human hair, often sourced from condemned criminals or impoverished women willing to trade their locks for a few coins. These wigs are architectural marvels, curled, teased, powdered, and pinned into gravity-defying sculptures that add several inches to Elizabeth's height and several pounds to her skull. But wigs, for all their aesthetic advantages, create the perfect ecosystem for lice. Dark, warm, and largely undisturbed, they offer everything a discerning parasite could want. The Queen's scalp, hidden beneath layers of false hair, becomes a breeding ground that would make an entomologist weep with joy. The symptoms are subtle but persistent. Elizabeth develops the habit of carrying a thin ivory rod, ostensibly for pointing at documents or emphasizing rhetorical points. In reality, it's a scratching stick, a discreet tool for reaching beneath her elaborate coiffures to provide relief from the constant itching. Her ladies-in-waiting become expert at reading the signs, a slight tilt of the head during council meetings, a barely perceptible reaching gesture during audiences, the need for sudden private moments to adjust her headpiece. They develop an intricate system of signals and diversions, creating opportunities for the Queen to address her discomfort without compromising her dignity. The morning ritual of wig preparation becomes a delicate operation. Before the false hair is arranged, Elizabeth's scalp must be examined, treated, and prepared. Her ladies use fine-toothed combs to remove the most obvious inhabitants, dropping the evidence discreetly into bowls of vinegar, where the offending creatures meet their watery doom. Various remedies are attempted. Rosemary oil, believed to repel insects. Pennyroyal, applied as a rinse despite its reputation for causing miscarriages, a risk Elizabeth is uniquely unconcerned about. Mercury compounds, which kill lice efficiently but slowly poison everything else. The cure often proves worse than the condition. The Queen's hat collection grows extensive, not merely for fashion, but for practical concealment. Wide-brimmed creations adorned with feathers and jewels draw attention upward while providing shade for any suspicious scratching below. During outdoor ceremonies, she's never without some form of head covering, ostensibly to protect her complexion, but practically to contain any aerial evacuees from her scalp. Court etiquette evolves to accommodate the Queen's condition. Deep bows become mandatory, ensuring that courtiers' eyes remain safely fixed on the floor rather than the Queen's hairline. Standing too close during conversations is discouraged. Artists painting royal portraits learn to focus on Elizabeth's hands, her jewels, her clothes, anything but the suspicious activity occurring around her temples. The problem extends beyond mere discomfort. Lice are vectors for disease, particularly typhus, which can kill with medieval efficiency. Elizabeth's physicians fret constantly about the health implications of her unwelcome tenants, but their cure, shaving the head completely, is politically impossible. A bald queen would be a laughingstock, an admission of mortality that could destabilize the entire kingdom. Instead, they recommend increasingly bizarre treatments: caps soaked in mercury and worn overnight, plasters of ground mustard seed and goose fat, spread across the scalp and left until the burning becomes unbearable, fumigation with sulfur candles, which clear the lice but leave the Queen smelling like a geological formation. The Queen's sleeping arrangements reflect her condition. Her bedchambers are cleaned obsessively, with particular attention to the pillows and linens that might harbour escapees from her scalp. Fresh straw is laid weekly, scented with pennyroyal and wormwood. Servants check the bed linens each morning, searching for signs of overnight migration. Elizabeth develops a paranoid attention to anyone else's hair scratching. Court members who display too obvious signs of infestation find themselves suddenly excluded from private audiences. Foreign diplomats are observed carefully for suspicious head movements. The Queen herself becomes an expert at detecting the telltale signs of lice-ridden visitors. Her correspondence suffers as well. Letters written during particularly intense infestations show subtle signs of distraction, words repeated, sentences left unfinished, ink blots where her concentration has wavered. Foreign ambassadors learn to schedule important discussions during the morning hours, after her scalp has been treated, but before the day's accumulated stress has awakened her tiny tenants. The psychological toll is perhaps worse than the physical discomfort. Elizabeth, who controls every other aspect of her image with iron discipline, finds herself at the mercy of creatures too small to see clearly but impossible to ignore. She develops obsessive behaviours around head coverings, refuses to allow mirrors in her private chambers, and grows increasingly sensitive about anyone approaching her from behind, where they might observe the evidence of her condition. But the show must go on. Elizabeth appears in public, with her towering wigs perfectly arranged, her jewelled headpieces glittering in the candlelight, her posture erect and commanding. If her scalp itches, she endures it. If her tiny tenants multiply, she hides it. If foreign dignitaries notice the occasional scratch, she diverts attention with wit, wisdom, or the barely concealed threat of the Tower of London. Her portraits from this era show increasingly elaborate headwear, wigs that seem to grow larger and more ornate with each passing year. Art historians note the progression with interest. Medical historians note it with horror. The Queen's head becomes a monument to the power of denial, an architectural marvel built on a foundation of lice. And still she rules. Still she inspires. Still she commands the respect and fear of nations. Because Elizabeth understands that monarchy is theatre, and good theatre requires the audience to focus on the performance, not the parasites. Her lice, like her subjects, learn their place in the grand hierarchy. They may share her scalp, but they do not share her crown. Behind those carefully painted lips, beyond the diplomatic smiles that have charmed foreign princes and terrified domestic traitors, lies perhaps the most horrifying aspect of Elizabeth's personal hygiene: her mouth. By middle age, the Virgin Queen's dental situation has deteriorated to the point where opening her mouth becomes an act of biological warfare. The culprit, like so many villains in Tudor history, is sugar. Sweet, precious, devastatingly expensive sugar that pours into England from Caribbean plantations like crystallized corruption. Sugar has transformed from exotic medicine to status symbol, and Elizabeth, with her legendary sweet tooth and unlimited access to luxury, consumes it with the enthusiasm of someone who has never heard the word cavity. Her daily diet reads like a confectioner's fever dream: candied fruits that glisten like jewels, marzipan sculptures elaborate enough to require their own architects, sugar plate, edible dinnerware crafted from pure sugar that dissolves on the tongue like sweet destruction, suckets, those syrupy fruit preserves that coat the mouth with concentrated decay. During royal banquets, sugar becomes performance art. Entire castles constructed from sugar paste, complete with tiny sugar soldiers and sugar cannons. Sugar flowers so realistic they fool the eye, but destroy the teeth. Elizabeth presides over these confectionery kingdoms like a sweet-toothed tyrant, sampling each creation with regal enthusiasm. The results are predictable and horrifying. By her 40s, Elizabeth's teeth have begun their slow surrender to decay. They darken first, taking on the yellowish tinge that marks the beginning of the end. Then they blacken, becoming small monuments to mortality in an otherwise carefully maintained facade of eternal youth. Contemporary observers note the transformation with fascination and horror. One visiting diplomat writes that Her Majesty's teeth are black, a defect the English seem to suffer much from, through their too great use of sugar. Another notes that she speaks increasingly carefully, as if each word must be considered not just for its political implications, but for its dental ones. The pain, when it comes, is excruciating. Elizabeth, who has faced down Spanish invasions and parliamentary rebellions without flinching, finds herself brought low by infected molars and obsessed incisors. She suffers in royal silence, but her closest attendants learn to read the signs: the way she holds her jaw, the careful sipping of wine, the sudden retreats to private chambers during formal dinners. Tudor dentistry offers little relief and considerable additional horror. The tools of the trade resemble instruments of torture more than medical equipment. Crude pliers for extraction, thin probes for exploring the depths of decay, and saws for the truly desperate cases. Anesthesia consists of strong spirits and prayer. When Elizabeth finally submits to dental intervention, it becomes a royal production. Her physician in ordinary consults with barber surgeons, apothecaries, and anyone else brave enough to approach the royal mouth. The chosen practitioner faces a challenge that would daunt modern dentists armed with lasers and lidocaine: how to work inside the mouth of a woman who controls the fate of nations while she's experiencing the kind of pain that reduces most people to whimpering. One particularly dramatic episode, recorded in palace accounts, describes the removal of a severely infected tooth that had been causing the Queen agony for weeks. Elizabeth, terrified of the procedure, demands that a volunteer demonstrate the process first. A loyal bishop, proving that religious devotion has no bounds, allows one of his own healthy teeth to be extracted as reassurance. Only then does the Queen submit to the dentist's pliers. The extraction is successful but brutal. Elizabeth, grey-faced and trembling, retreats to her chambers for a week of recovery, during which she refuses all public appearances and subsists on broths and wine. Her speech, when she finally returns to court, carries a slight lisp that becomes part of her regal mystique. Between these traumatic interventions, Elizabeth manages her dental decay through increasingly desperate measures. She develops an arsenal of mouth rinses, rose water for freshness, vinegar for its supposed antiseptic properties, wine mixed with herbs for pain relief. She carries scented handkerchiefs, not just for show, but to provide discreet cover when the pain overwhelms her composure. Her diet adapts to accommodate her deteriorating teeth. Hard foods disappear from her personal meals. Roasted meats give way to soft stews. Bread must be soaked in wine or broth before consumption. Eventually, even speaking becomes carefully measured, each word chosen not just for its political impact, but for its compatibility with her remaining teeth. The social implications are staggering. Elizabeth, whose wit and eloquence have been her greatest weapons, finds herself increasingly reluctant to speak at length. Her famous orations become shorter, more carefully planned affairs. Private audiences, once notorious for their hours-long duration, become brief, formal encounters. Her portrait painters face new challenges. How does one capture the majesty of a queen whose smile has become a carefully guarded secret? Artists learn to position her with closed lips, or capture her in profile, or focus on her hands rather than her face. The iconic images of Elizabeth in her later years show a woman of dignity and power, but never one who smiles widely enough to reveal the decay within. Court etiquette evolves to protect the royal dignity. Courtiers learn to position themselves at respectful distances during conversations. Foreign ambassadors are briefed on appropriate speaking volumes and distances. The Queen's breath, once a concern only for her most intimate attendants, becomes a matter of international diplomacy. Her correspondence reveals the personal toll. Letters from her later years show increasing reliance on secretaries, fewer personal notes in her own hand. When she does write personally, the content becomes more formal, less intimate, as if the physical act of forming words has become associated with pain. But Elizabeth, ever the strategist, finds ways to turn even dental disaster to her advantage. Her careful speech patterns become associated with wisdom and deliberation. Her reluctance to smile widely is interpreted as royal reserve. Her preference for private dining becomes evidence of her dedication to state business over personal pleasure. The tragic irony is that sugar, the very substance destroying her teeth, has become a symbol of English prosperity and power. The Caribbean colonies that produce it are jewels in her imperial crown. The sugar trade that rots her mouth also fills her treasury. Elizabeth literally consumes the sweetness of empire while it consumes her from within. Her final years see the complete capitulation of her dental defences. Multiple extractions have left gaps that whistle when she speaks. The remaining teeth are loose, discoloured monuments to a lifetime of sugar consumption. She survives on soft foods, liquid nutrition, and sheer force of will. Yet somehow the myth endures. Portrait after portrait shows her with smooth, ageless features and carefully closed lips. Foreign visitors describe her presence as commanding, her voice as authoritative. The reality of dental decay is buried beneath layers of royal protocol and artistic discretion. When Elizabeth dies, her mouth takes its secrets to the grave. The post-mortem examination, brief and respectful, notes only that she was of good complexion and well-favoured. The dental catastrophe that shaped her later years disappears from the official record, leaving only the image of eternal youth and power. But the sugar remains. Sweet, seductive, and ultimately destructive, it continues to pour into England's ports, enriching the empire that Elizabeth built while destroying the mouths of those who consume it. The Virgin Queen's legacy is written in many things: laws, wars, literature, and the slow, sweet decay of a civilization that learned to love what killed it. Her teeth may have crumbled, but her crown endured. Each morning, as London awakens to the sounds of church bells and chamber pot emptying, a more elaborate ritual unfolds in the royal chambers of Whitehall. Elizabeth's transformation from mortal woman to divine monarch begins before dawn, in the flickering light of beeswax candles, with the careful application of what can only be described as toxic artistry. The process starts with ceruse, that deceptively named white lead foundation that will eventually prove more dangerous than any Spanish assassin. Made from white lead and vinegar, ceruse creates the ghostly pale complexion that has become Elizabeth's signature look. It's also slowly poisoning her, but in the 16th century, beauty requires sacrifice, and Elizabeth has always been willing to pay any price for power. Her ladies-in-waiting approach this daily ritual with the precision of military strategists and the reverence of religious acolytes. They understand that they're not merely applying cosmetics, they're constructing a myth, painting a goddess, creating the face that will gaze down from 1,000 portraits and inspire 1,000,000 subjects. The ceruse is mixed fresh each morning, the lead powder whisked with vinegar until it achieves the consistency of thick cream. The smell is sharp, metallic, with an undertone that makes sensitive noses twitch, and experienced servants work quickly. Elizabeth sits motionless as the first layer is applied with soft brushes, her skin disappearing beneath a mask of white that's luminous, ethereal, and completely artificial. But ceruse alone is not enough. Over this alabaster base comes a delicate dusting of crushed pearls, real pearls, ground to powder at enormous expense, because Elizabeth's face deserves nothing less than oceanic luxury. The pearl dust catches candlelight and creates an otherworldly glow that suggests divinity rather than mortality. Her cheeks receive a touch of vermilion, that brilliant red pigment made from mercury sulfide. Mercury, like lead, is a poison that works slowly and silently, but its effects are immediately beautiful. The red blends into the white like blood into milk, creating the suggestion of life beneath the painted death mask. Her lips are outlined with cochineal, a rich red dye extracted from crushed beetles, imported from the New World. Thousands of tiny insects die for Elizabeth's smile, their bodies processed into pigment that stains her mouth the colour of fresh blood. The irony is not lost on those who understand that the Virgin Queen's beauty literally consumes life. Her eyebrows, plucked to near invisibility in accordance with the fashion of high foreheads, are redrawn with a mixture of charcoal and mouse fur. Yes, mouse fur, tiny, soft hairs glued in place with fish bladder adhesive to create the perfect arch above her eyes. The mice, presumably, did not volunteer for this honour. The entire process takes hours. Layer upon layer of poison and pigment, each application building the facade that will face the world. Elizabeth sits through it all with the patience of a saint and the calculation of a chess master, because she understands that this daily transformation is the foundation of her power. But ceruse is a cruel mistress. While it creates that supernatural paleness that marks Elizabeth as something beyond mortal ken, it also destroys the skin it claims to perfect. Lead seeps through pores, accumulates in organs, and slowly devastates the body from within. Elizabeth's skin beneath the makeup becomes increasingly damaged, scarred, pitted, and dependent on ever thicker applications of the very substance that's destroying it. The morning routine becomes a battle between decay and disguise. Blemishes must be covered, new wrinkles hidden, the growing evidence of lead poisoning disguised beneath fresh applications of the same toxin. Elizabeth's ladies become expert at reading the geography of damage beneath the paint, knowing exactly where to apply extra coverage, which areas need the heaviest foundation, how to create the illusion of perfection over a canvas of corruption. The psychological toll is perhaps worse than the physical damage. Elizabeth can never be seen without her makeup, never appear before anyone in her natural state. She becomes a prisoner of her own image, trapped behind a painted mask that she dare not remove. Mirrors disappear from her private chambers in later years because the contrast between her painted public face and her natural appearance has become too stark to bear. But the real horror isn't the toxicity of the cosmetics, or even their addictive necessity. It's the gradual fusion of woman and mask. After decades of daily application, Elizabeth's natural facial expressions adapt to accommodate the painted facade. She learns to smile without cracking the ceruse, to speak without disturbing the lip colour, to convey emotion through subtle shifts in posture rather than facial expression. Her painted face becomes more real than her natural one. Foreign ambassadors describe the ethereal queen with her luminous complexion and ageless features. Artists paint portrait after portrait of the pale goddess. Poets compose verses about her marble beauty. Nobody mentions that they're all describing the effects of lead poisoning and insect-based cosmetics. The application process itself becomes a state secret. Only the most trusted ladies are permitted to witness Elizabeth's transformation from woman to monarch. They take oaths of silence that are enforced with the enthusiasm typically reserved for treason trials. To reveal the Queen's natural appearance becomes tantamount to revealing state secrets. As Elizabeth ages, the makeup grows thicker, the applications more frequent, the dependency more complete. Touch-ups occur throughout the day, discreetly managed by ladies-in-waiting who carry concealed powders and pigments. The painted mask must never crack, never fade, never reveal the mortal woman beneath. The lead-based ceruse begins to affect more than just Elizabeth's appearance. Lead poisoning brings fatigue, confusion, and tremors. Her famous sharp wit may be dulled by the very cosmetics that create her divine appearance. But she persists, because to appear without the makeup would be to appear mortal, and mortal queens can be overthrown. Foreign courts attempt to replicate Elizabeth's look, but few have access to the same quality of poison or the same willingness to sacrifice health for beauty. French courtiers achieve pale complexions, but not that otherworldly glow. Spanish ladies manage the red lips, but not the perfect white skin. Elizabeth's toxic beauty becomes as much a statement of English superiority as her navy or her rhetoric. The environmental cost is staggering. Lead mining increases to meet the demand for ceruse. Mercury extraction expands to supply vermilion. Entire beetle populations are harvested for cochineal. Elizabeth's face becomes a small-scale ecological disaster, consuming resources and destroying life in service of an image. But perhaps most tragically, the painted mask begins to replace Elizabeth's natural expressions of emotion. Joy, sorrow, anger, love, all must be conveyed through carefully modulated voice and gesture rather than facial expression. The lead-based makeup creates a beautiful death mask over a living face, preserving her image while slowly destroying her humanity. Her final portraits show the ultimate triumph of art over nature. Elizabeth appears ageless, perfect, divine, a painted icon rather than a living woman. The artists have learned to depict not her actual appearance, but the ideal she represents. The lead has done its work so thoroughly that the painted face and the royal myth have become indistinguishable. When Elizabeth dies, her attendants face a final irony. In death, freed from the need to maintain the illusion, her natural face is revealed. But by then, after decades of lead exposure, the distinction between the painted mask and the poisoned reality beneath has become meaningless. The ceruse has become part of her, transforming her from queen into artifact, from woman into immortal image. The lead that preserved her appearance in life, preserved her legend in death. Elizabeth's painted face gazes down from portraits across the centuries. Beautiful, ageless, and utterly artificial, the perfect symbol of a monarchy that valued appearance above truth, image above life, and power above everything. Her face became her masterpiece and her tomb. If Elizabeth's face is a painted lie, her clothing represents an entire mythology of misdirection. Layer upon layer of silk, velvet, and brocade serve not merely as fashion statements, but as elaborate camouflage for a body that has become increasingly difficult to maintain. Beneath the jeweled bodices and pearl-encrusted sleeves lies a woman whose personal hygiene has devolved into a careful choreography of concealment. The foundation of Elizabeth's daily costume is her linen undergarments, shift, stockings, and that peculiar Tudor invention, the farthingale. These items are changed daily, sometimes twice daily, because they serve as the first line of defense between Elizabeth's increasingly problematic body and the precious outer garments that must maintain their pristine appearance for weeks or months at a time. Her shifts are marvels of Tudor textile technology. Fine linen, so soft it feels like silk, sewn with seams so delicate they're practically invisible, embroidered with silk threads in patterns that would make angels weep. These garments absorb sweat, oils, and other bodily secretions with the dedication of textile martyrs. They're boiled clean in vast copper cauldrons, dried in palace courtyards, and replaced faster than Elizabeth replaces ministers. But the real genius of Elizabeth's wardrobe lies in its architectural ambition. Her gowns are not clothing so much as wearable buildings, constructed with whalebone, wire, and enough padding to conceal a small rebellion. The farthingale alone, that wheel-shaped contraption that extends her hips to impossible dimensions, creates enough distance between Elizabeth and any observer to prevent detailed inspection of her person. The ruffs deserve special mention, if only for their commitment to atmospheric protection. These pleated linen monstrosities, starched to supernatural stiffness and expanded to dinner plate proportions, create a barrier around Elizabeth's neck that would challenge a medieval siege engineer. Nothing can approach her throat, her chin, or the lower portions of her face without navigating these textile fortifications. Her sleeves, meanwhile, represent perhaps the most extreme example of functional fashion in human history. Constructed with enough fabric to outfit a small army, they puff and billow around her arms like textile clouds. The effect is magnificent, certainly, but the practical benefit is even more impressive. No one can get close enough to Elizabeth to detect any atmospheric irregularities that might emanate from her person. The colour choices are strategic as well. Rich reds hide stains, deep blues disguise discoloration, pure white, Elizabeth's favourite, is changed so frequently that any evidence of wear disappears before it can be noticed. Her wardrobe accounts reveal the staggering cost of maintaining this illusion: hundreds of gowns in various stages of construction, cleaning, or retirement. Jewels serve a dual purpose, adding magnificence while creating visual distraction. Pearls cascade down her bodice in rivers of oceanic luxury. Diamonds catch candlelight and throw it back in prismatic displays that dazzle observers into temporary blindness. Rubies glow like captured fire. The overall effect is so overwhelming that few people notice anything beyond the immediate spectacle of reflected light and architectural fashion. But perhaps the most ingenious aspect of Elizabeth's wardrobe is its independence from her body. The gowns are constructed to stand alone, supported by internal frameworks that could probably function without a human inhabitant. Elizabeth essentially lives inside these textile monuments, her actual physical presence almost incidental to the overall effect. The morning process of dressing becomes an engineering challenge that would impress cathedral builders. Elizabeth stands motionless while her ladies construct the day's costume around her like armour. First the undergarments, then the structural elements, then the gown itself, and finally the accessories that transform her from woman into walking artwork. The weight is extraordinary. A full court costume can weigh 40 pounds or more, distributed across Elizabeth's frame through a complex system of straps, hooks, and supports. She moves carefully, deliberately, not just from royal dignity, but from practical necessity. One wrong step could result in textile catastrophe. The psychological effect on Elizabeth herself is profound. Encased in her daily costume, she becomes untouchable, literally and figuratively. No casual contact is possible. Embraces are architectural impossibilities. Even handshakes require careful negotiation around ruffs, sleeves, and the various protrusions of Tudor fashion. But this isolation serves her purposes perfectly. Elizabeth has transformed herself into a living icon, approachable only on carefully controlled terms. Her subjects see majesty, divinity, power made visible. They cannot see the woman inside the costume, cannot detect the various biological realities that the clothing exists to conceal. The maintenance of this wardrobe becomes a full-time occupation for dozens of servants. Seamstresses work around the clock repairing damage, adjusting fit, and creating new pieces. Laundresses battle stains with lye soap and prayer. Specialized attendants exist solely to manage the complex process of dressing and undressing the Queen. Storage presents its own challenges. Elizabeth's gowns require entire rooms, hung on specially constructed frames to prevent crushing. Moths are a constant threat, battled with lavender, cedar, and aromatic herbs. Humidity must be controlled to prevent fabric degradation. The wardrobe accounts read like military requisitions, listing the resources needed to maintain textile perfection. As Elizabeth ages, her reliance on her wardrobe's concealing properties increases. Padding becomes more strategic, designed not just for fashion, but to disguise the physical changes that time and poor hygiene have wrought. Corsetry grows more elaborate, creating artificial shapes where natural ones have failed. The gap between Elizabeth's actual body and her clothed appearance widens with each passing year. Foreign visitors struggle to understand the sheer scale of Elizabeth's sartorial commitment. One Spanish ambassador notes that the Queen appears to be wearing an entire palace rather than clothes. A French courtier observes that Elizabeth's costume seems designed more for display than for the convenience of human habitation. But the system works. Elizabeth appears in public as a figure of supernatural magnificence, her mortality hidden beneath layers of silk and architecture. She becomes a walking advertisement for English prosperity, textile skill, and the divine right of monarchs to transcend ordinary human limitations. The tragic irony is that the very clothing that conceals Elizabeth's physical deterioration also accelerates it. The weight strains her frame, the tight lacings restrict breathing, the inability to move naturally affects her posture and circulation. She becomes a prisoner of her own magnificence, trapped inside costumes that preserve her image, while slowly destroying her body. Yet she persists, because the alternative, appearing in public as a mortal woman subject to the same physical limitations as her subjects, would undermine the entire foundation of her authority. Better to suffer in silk than to rule in rags. The evening undressing becomes as elaborate as the morning construction. Each layer must be removed carefully, examined for damage, prepared for cleaning or storage. Elizabeth emerges from her daily costume like a butterfly in reverse, shedding magnificence to reveal the increasingly frail woman beneath. But by morning, the process begins again. The linen, the structures, the gowns, the jewels, all assembled with military precision to create the daily miracle of Elizabeth's public appearance. The woman disappears inside the costume, and the Queen emerges to face her subjects and her enemies with equal magnificence. Her wardrobe becomes her armour, her disguise, her escape from mortality. Behind the ruffs and farthingales, beneath the pearls and brocade, Elizabeth the woman may struggle with the basic challenges of hygiene and health. But Elizabeth the Queen, clothed in textile glory, remains eternally magnificent. The clothes, quite literally, make the monarch. If Elizabeth's clothing serves as architectural concealment, and her makeup as painted deception, her approach to scent represents perhaps the most aggressive assault on olfactory reality in the history of monarchy. Tudor England exists in a perpetual state of aromatic warfare, with pleasant scents locked in mortal combat against the persistent realities of inadequate sanitation. And Elizabeth has positioned herself as the supreme general in this fragrant battlefield. The Queen's personal perfumer, a nervous man named Guillaume who speaks French with the desperation of someone whose life depends on customer satisfaction, maintains a laboratory that resembles an alchemist's fever dream. Shelves line the walls from floor to ceiling, bearing bottles, vials and containers, holding every scented substance known to the civilized world, and several that would challenge that description. Rose water forms the foundation of Elizabeth's aromatic arsenal. Not the delicate floral water that modern romantics might imagine, but an industrial-strength rose concentrate capable of overwhelming a horse at 50 paces. Guillaume imports Bulgarian rose petals by the hundredweight, distilling them in copper stills that work day and night like aromatic factories. The resulting essence is so concentrated that a single drop can scent an entire room, which is precisely the point. Orange flower water provides the second line of defense. Extracted from civil orange blossoms through a process so labor-intensive that it requires an entire team of dedicated petal pluckers working in shifts. The scent is supposed to suggest sunshine and Mediterranean breezes, though in practice it more closely resembles what might happen if a Spanish citrus grove collided with a French brothel. But Guillaume's true genius lies in his compound perfumes, complex aromatic symphonies that layer scent upon scent until the final result transcends mere fragrance and achieves something approaching olfactory architecture. These perfumes don't simply smell pleasant, they create entirely new atmospheric conditions wherever Elizabeth appears. Her signature scent, known to court insiders as Gloriana's Garden, combines rose, orange blossom, jasmine, and musk in proportions that Guillaume guards more carefully than state secrets. The musk alone, derived from glands extracted from Tibetan deer, who presumably had other plans for their evening, costs more per ounce than most people earn in a year. The application process begins before dawn, as Elizabeth's ladies anoint her with enough perfume to scent a small cathedral. Her undergarments are soaked in rose water. Her stockings are dusted with powdered orris root. Her gloves are stuffed with aromatic herbs that release their scent with every gesture. By the time she's fully dressed, Elizabeth has become less a person than a walking aromatherapy experience. But the real innovation lies in the environmental scenting that accompanies Elizabeth, wherever she goes. Her chambers are fumigated daily with burning pastils made from benzoin, storax, and frankincense. Pomanders, those perforated silver spheres filled with aromatic spices, hang from every available surface like olfactory ornaments. Fresh herbs are strewn across the floors and replaced twice daily, creating carpets of crushing fragrance beneath the royal feet. The Queen's furniture receives its own aromatic treatment. Chair cushions are stuffed with lavender and rose petals. Tapestries are sprayed with scented waters. Even her close stool, that essential royal accessory, is perfumed with enough flower essence to make the most necessary biological functions seem positively pastoral. Her personal effects become weapons in the aromatic war. Handkerchiefs are soaked in perfume so powerful that they function as portable atmosphere changers. Fans are constructed with scented woods and aromatic oils, creating breeze-borne clouds of fragrance with every flutter. Her jewellery boxes exhale perfume like scented sighs whenever opened. The psychological warfare aspect cannot be overlooked. Foreign ambassadors, accustomed to the more modest scenting practices of their own courts, find themselves overwhelmed by the aromatic assault of Elizabeth's presence. Many report difficulty concentrating during audiences, their minds dulled by the narcotic effects of industrial-strength rosewater and concentrated musk. Elizabeth herself appears to have developed an immunity to her own aromatic artillery, requiring ever stronger concentrations to achieve the desired effect. What begins as pleasant scenting evolves into something approaching chemical warfare, with Elizabeth at the centre of an aromatic storm that would fell lesser mortals. The cost is astronomical. Guillaume's accounts reveal expenditures that rival military budgets, rare ingredients imported from Asia, Africa, and the Americas, specialised equipment for distillation and extraction, teams of workers dedicated solely to the production of royal fragrance. Elizabeth's aromatic habits single-handedly support international trade routes and several small economies. But the real genius of the system lies in its psychological effect on Elizabeth herself. Surrounded by carefully constructed pleasantness, she becomes insulated from the olfactory evidence of her own declining hygiene. The contrast between her artificially scented environment and the natural reality of her body becomes so extreme that she may genuinely lose awareness of her own aromatic shortcomings. Court etiquette evolves to accommodate the aromatic intensity. Visitors learn to take shallow breaths during audiences to avoid overwhelming their senses. Servants develop the ability to work efficiently while breathing through their mouths. Foreign diplomats begin bringing their own scented handkerchiefs as protective equipment. The environmental impact extends far beyond Elizabeth's immediate vicinity. Entire palace wings become suffused with her aromatic presence. Corridors retain the scent of her passage for hours after she's moved on. Rooms that haven't seen the Queen in months still carry traces of her perfumed visits, like aromatic ghosts. As Elizabeth ages, her reliance on artificial scenting increases exponentially. What once required a splash of rosewater now demands entire bottles. Perfumes that formerly lasted days must be reapplied hourly. The aromatic arms race escalates until Elizabeth exists in a constantly maintained cloud of artificial pleasantness that moves with her like a personal weather system. The irony is profound. In her efforts to disguise the natural consequences of poor hygiene, Elizabeth has created aromatic conditions so extreme that they become their own form of assault. Courtiers learn to recognize her approach, not by sight or sound, but by the advancing wall of concentrated fragrance that precedes her, like an olfactory herald. Her letters from this period carry physical evidence of her aromatic obsession. The paper itself is scented, the ink mixed with aromatic oils, the sealing wax perfumed. Foreign recipients report that Elizabeth's correspondence retains its fragrance for months, creating international incidents of inadvertent aromatherapy. But perhaps the most telling detail lies in the accounts of those rare moments when Elizabeth appears without her full aromatic armour. These occasions, usually during illness or emergency, reveal the shocking contrast between her artificially maintained pleasantness and her natural state. The few witnesses to these moments describe the experience with the kind of traumatic specificity usually reserved for military disasters. Yet the system endures because it works, at least in its primary function of maintaining royal dignity. Elizabeth appears in public surrounded by such intensive pleasantness that observers remember only the aromatic luxury, not any underlying realities it might conceal. She becomes associated with gardens, with flowers, with all things sweet and beautiful. The aromatic mythology grows until Elizabeth herself seems to naturally emanate pleasantness, as if fragrance were her divine gift, rather than her desperate necessity. Poets write verses about her rose-scented presence. Courtiers speak of her floral majesty. The artificial becomes accepted as natural. The desperate becomes admired as divine. When death finally claims her, Elizabeth's chambers retain their aromatic intensity for weeks. The perfumes that served as her life's disguise become her memorial, creating a fragrant ghost that haunts Whitehall long after the Queen herself has departed, for whatever afterlife awaits monarchs who've spent their earthly existence in chemical warfare against their own mortality. Her nose may have failed her, but her perfumer's art ensured that no one else's would survive the encounter. While Elizabeth wages her aromatic war against the evidence of mortality, a more insidious battle unfolds within the very cosmetics and treatments she depends upon. The Renaissance, for all its artistic achievements and intellectual breakthroughs, remains blissfully ignorant of basic chemistry. The same substances that create Elizabeth's supernatural beauty are simultaneously destroying her from within, turning her into a case study in heavy metal poisoning disguised as divine monarchy. Lead, mercury and arsenic, the holy trinity of Tudor toxicity, form the foundation of Elizabeth's beauty regimen. Each morning, she applies these poisons to her skin with the devotion of a religious ritual, unaware that she's slowly transforming herself into a walking chemistry experiment. The irony would be amusing if it weren't so thoroughly lethal. The lead in her ceruse makeup doesn't simply sit on her skin like modern cosmetics. Lead is absorbent, persistent, and cumulative. Day after day, year after year, it seeps through her pores and accumulates in her organs like microscopic deposits of mortality. Her liver, kidneys, and brain begin their slow, invisible surrender to the very substances that create her legendary appearance. The symptoms manifest gradually, disguised as the natural consequences of royal life. Fatigue is attributed to the burdens of monarchy rather than lead poisoning. Memory lapses become evidence of deep royal contemplation rather than neurological damage. The tremor in her hands is described as artistic sensitivity rather than metal toxicity. Mercury proves even more insidious, present in her lip colour, her rouge, and various medical treatments. It infiltrates her system with the persistence of a determined spy. Mercury poisoning brings its own special gifts, mood swings that courtiers interpret as royal temperament, coordination problems dismissed as the natural result of heavy costumes, and a gradual loosening of teeth that Elizabeth attributes to age rather than chemical destruction. Arsenic, meanwhile, appears in her various skin treatments and medicines, often disguised as beneficial compounds designed to preserve her youthful complexion. Tudor physicians, working with medical knowledge that would embarrass a modern veterinarian, prescribe arsenic-based preparations for everything from skin blemishes to digestive troubles. They might as well be prescribing deliberate suicide, but they do so with the confidence of men who believe they understand the mysteries of human chemistry. The cumulative effect transforms Elizabeth into a living laboratory of toxic accumulation. Her famous pallor, celebrated by poets and artists, owes as much to heavy metal poisoning as to aristocratic breeding. Her ethereal appearance reflects not divine favour, but systematic chemical destruction. She becomes beautiful in the way that certain poisons are beautiful, attractive, otherworldly, and ultimately deadly. But Elizabeth, like her subjects, operates within the medical understanding of her era. The concept of chronic toxicity hasn't been invented yet. The idea that daily applications of beneficial substances could accumulate into lethal doses remains beyond contemporary comprehension. She applies her makeup each morning with the same confidence that modern people take vitamins, unaware that she's consuming death by installments. Her physicians, meanwhile, compound the problem with treatments that add new toxins to her already overloaded system. When she complains of fatigue, they prescribe mercury-based tonics. When her skin shows signs of irritation, they recommend arsenic-based cleansers. When her teeth begin to loosen, they suggest lead-based mouth rinses. Each treatment worsens the underlying condition it's meant to cure. The environmental contamination spreads beyond Elizabeth herself. Her chambers become repositories of accumulated toxins, with lead dust settling into tapestries, mercury vapour permeating the air, and arsenic residue coating every surface she touches regularly. Her servants, exposed to these conditions daily, begin showing their own symptoms of chronic poisoning, though these are typically attributed to the natural hazards of palace life. Elizabeth's famous wigs become particularly problematic, serving as collectors and concentrators of toxic residue. The elaborate hairpieces, worn for hours at a time in close contact with her painted face, absorb years' worth of chemical runoff. When the wigs are finally cleaned or replaced, the process releases concentrated doses of accumulated poisons into the air, creating temporary toxic clouds that affect everyone in the vicinity. Her clothing, too, becomes contaminated. The high collars and tight sleeves that trap her cosmetics against her skin also trap the chemical byproducts of her beauty regimen. Laundresses handling these garments report unusual skin conditions, respiratory problems, and other symptoms that modern toxicologists would recognize immediately as signs of heavy metal exposure. The international implications prove fascinating. Foreign diplomats visiting Elizabeth's court often report mysterious illnesses following their audiences with the Queen. They attribute these afflictions to English climate, unfamiliar food, or the stress of international negotiation. In reality, they're experiencing acute exposure to Elizabeth's toxic environment, a form of chemical diplomacy that gives new meaning to the phrase poisoning international relations. Elizabeth's legendary longevity, often cited as evidence of her robust constitution, may actually reflect her body's gradual adaptation to chronic poisoning. Like certain organisms that develop tolerance to environmental toxins, she learns to function despite carrying what would be lethal loads of heavy metals in any normal person. She becomes a walking testament to the human body's disturbing ability to accommodate systematic chemical abuse. The psychological effects prove even more intriguing. Lead and mercury poisoning can cause personality changes, mood disorders, and cognitive difficulties. Elizabeth's famous temper, her periodic episodes of depression, and her increasing paranoia in later years may reflect not just the stresses of monarchy, but the neurological consequences of decades of chemical exposure. Her handwriting provides physical evidence of the toxicity's progression. Early letters show steady, confident script. Later correspondence reveals the tremor and uncertainty associated with heavy metal poisoning. Foreign analysts studying her diplomatic messages notice the change, but attribute it to aging rather than systematic self-poisoning. The courtiers surrounding Elizabeth develop their own adaptive strategies. Those who spend significant time in her presence learn to minimize direct contact, to position themselves upwind when possible, and to retreat frequently for fresh air breaks that are actually detoxification periods. The royal court becomes a study in toxic social dynamics, with proximity to the Queen offering political advantages at considerable physiological cost. Elizabeth's famous reluctance to touch her subjects, often interpreted as royal reserve or fear of contamination, may actually reflect an unconscious understanding that she has become the contamination. Her elaborate ritual of glove-wearing, hand-washing, and maintaining distance protects others as much as herself, though she likely doesn't understand this consciously. The preservation of her body, after death, reveals the extent of her chemical transformation. Centuries of accumulated lead, mercury, and arsenic have essentially mummified her from within, creating a corpse that remains remarkably well preserved. Elizabeth achieves in death the immortality that her toxic cosmetics promised in life, though not in the way she intended. Her legacy becomes a cautionary tale disguised as royal biography. Future generations read about her supernatural beauty, her otherworldly presence, her seemingly divine immunity to mortal concerns. They don't realize they're reading about one of history's most elaborate cases of chronic heavy metal poisoning, documented through portraits and preserved in poetry. The irony is perfect. Elizabeth's quest for eternal beauty through chemistry actually achieves a form of chemical eternity, just not the kind any reasonable person would choose. She becomes immortal not through divine favor, but through systematic toxicity, preserved not by God's grace, but by humanity's ignorance of basic chemistry. Her painted face gazes down from portraits across the centuries, beautiful, ageless, and thoroughly poisoned, the perfect symbol of an age that valued appearance over health, image over reality, and immediate gratification over long-term survival. Elizabeth doesn't just rule England, she becomes a chemical experiment with a crown. In the carefully orchestrated theatre of Elizabeth's court, perhaps no aspect requires more delicate management than the Queen's personal relationships. Behind the public pageantry of royal romance and the diplomatic choreography of potential marriages lies a more intimate challenge. How does one maintain personal connections when basic human contact has become a choreographed event designed to conceal the realities of declining hygiene. Elizabeth's famous status as the Virgin Queen takes on new dimensions when viewed through the lens of practical impossibility rather than political choice. The elaborate costume construction that encases her body daily makes spontaneous physical affection virtually impossible. A simple embrace requires architectural planning. A casual touch becomes a diplomatic incident involving multiple layers of fabric, whalebone, and strategic padding. Her closest relationships suffer under the weight of this necessary distance. Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, perhaps the one man who might have genuinely loved the woman beneath the crown, finds himself perpetually kept at arm's length by circumstances both political and practical. Their famous relationship, the subject of endless court gossip and international speculation, must be conducted within the strict boundaries of what Elizabeth's physical condition will allow. Contemporary accounts describe their interactions with the kind of stilted formality that suggests real intimacy has become impossible. They speak across carefully maintained distances. They communicate through intermediaries, even when in the same room. Their alleged love affair, if it existed at all, must be conducted through glances, gestures, and the occasional exchange of scented handkerchiefs, the 16th century equivalent of social media romance. Robert Cecil, her chief minister, and perhaps her closest confidant, develops the political equivalent of a hazmat protocol for their private consultations. Meetings are scheduled for optimal times when the Queen's morning preparations have achieved maximum effectiveness but haven't yet degraded. Business is conducted with windows open for better light, but actually for better ventilation. Documents are passed through intermediaries to minimize direct contact. Her ladies-in-waiting occupy the most challenging position in this intimate minefield. They must maintain the fiction of normal royal service, while actually functioning as a human buffer zone between Elizabeth and the rest of humanity. They develop specialized skills, the ability to anticipate the Queen's needs without getting too close, to assist with personal matters while breathing through their mouths, to maintain loyal discretion about increasingly obvious realities. These women, drawn from the highest families in England, sign on expecting to serve a divine monarch, and find themselves functioning as a combination of ladies-in-waiting, hazmat technicians, and diplomatic corps. They rotate duties with the precision of military units, ensuring that no one individual bears the full burden of extended exposure to the royal presence. The psychological toll on Elizabeth herself proves devastating. A woman who once delighted in dancing, in close conversation, in the simple human pleasure of physical proximity, becomes increasingly isolated by the very preparations meant to make her more presentable. She watches relationships conducted at arm's length, conversations filtered through intermediaries, and affections expressed through gifts rather than gestures. Her famous flirtations with foreign princes and domestic courtiers take on a poignant quality when viewed through this lens. These elaborate romantic pageants, conducted entirely in public and heavily regulated by protocol, may represent her only opportunities for anything resembling personal connection. But even these carefully scripted interactions must observe the boundaries imposed by her physical condition. The French Duke of Anjou, Elizabeth's last serious suitor, provides perhaps the most telling example of how her hygiene challenges affect her personal relationships. Their courtship, conducted largely through correspondence and heavily chaperoned meetings, collapses when extended proximity becomes unavoidable. Contemporary observers note the Duke's increasing discomfort during extended audiences, his requests for more frequent breaks in their conversations, and his eventual retreat from England with diplomatic excuses that fool no one. Elizabeth's emotional responses to these relationship failures grow increasingly complex. She simultaneously craves human connection and dreads the intimacy that would reveal her carefully concealed realities. She becomes a master of emotional distance disguised as royal reserve, turning personal limitations into political strategy. Her correspondence reveals the strain. Letters to close friends and confidants show increasing formality over time, as if Elizabeth has forgotten how to express genuine emotion without the mediation of royal protocol. Personal relationships become indistinguishable from state business, with love letters reading like diplomatic treaties and friendly correspondence adopting the language of international negotiation. The courtiers surrounding Elizabeth adapt to these constraints by developing an elaborate social code that allows for the expression of affection without requiring physical proximity. Gifts replace gestures, written sentiments substitute for spoken endearments. The entire emotional life of the court becomes textual rather than physical, conducted through intermediaries and expressed through symbols. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of Elizabeth's isolation lies in her relationship with herself. The daily ritual of concealment and preparation creates a barrier not just between Elizabeth and others, but between Elizabeth and her own body. She becomes estranged from her physical self, viewing her natural state as something shameful that must be hidden rather than a normal aspect of human existence. Her mirrors, removed from private chambers in later years, represent more than vanity or denial. They symbolize her complete separation from authentic self-perception. Elizabeth the woman disappears so completely beneath Elizabeth the image that she may genuinely lose track of where the performance ends and the person begins. The few accounts of Elizabeth in unguarded moments, during illness, in private with her most trusted attendants, or in the rare instances when her preparation routine is disrupted, describe a woman who seems genuinely surprised by her own physicality, as if she's encountering a stranger inhabiting her body. Her famous deathbed scene, where she allegedly refused to lie down because monarchs die standing up, takes on new meaning when viewed as the final performance of a woman who has spent her entire life afraid to appear human. Even in death, she maintains the theatrical distance that has defined her relationships with everyone, including herself. The courtiers who survive her describe the aftermath with a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief at no longer maintaining the elaborate fiction of royal perfection. Sadness at the realization that they've spent decades serving an image rather than a person, maintaining relationships with a carefully constructed myth rather than a genuine human being. Elizabeth's legacy and personal relationships becomes a cautionary tale about the cost of perfection. Her famous independence, often celebrated as evidence of feminine strength and royal determination, may actually reflect the practical impossibility of maintaining genuine human connections under the constraints of her physical condition and social role. She achieves immortality through isolation, divinity through distance, and eternal youth through the elimination of intimate human contact. The Virgin Queen's status owes less to political calculation than to hygienic impossibility. In the end, Elizabeth's greatest tragedy may not be her childlessness or her political challenges, but her fundamental separation from the basic human experiences of touch, closeness, and unguarded affection. She rules an empire, but cannot embrace a friend. She commands the loyalty of millions, but cannot experience genuine intimacy with a single person. Her heart may have been English, as she famously declared, but her body had become untouchable. As the 16th century draws to its close, so does Elizabeth's long battle against the inevitable consequences of a lifetime spent in chemical warfare against her own mortality. The various toxins, the accumulated poisons, and the systematic denial of basic hygiene finally achieve their cumulative victory. The Virgin Queen enters her final years as a walking advertisement for the dangers of prioritizing image over health, appearance over reality. By her mid-60s, Elizabeth has become a carefully maintained ruin. The lead-based makeup that once created an otherworldly pallor now serves primarily to conceal the damage it has itself inflicted. Her skin beneath the cosmetics has achieved a texture that would challenge leather workers, scarred and pitted by decades of chemical assault. The ceruse that promised eternal youth has delivered a form of preservation more commonly associated with ancient mummies. Her teeth, those few that remain, exist as loose reminders of a mouth that once charmed ambassadors and terrorized traitors. Speaking becomes an exercise in careful navigation, each word planned not just for its political impact, but for its compatibility with her deteriorated dental situation. Foreign visitors note that audiences with the Queen have grown shorter, her speeches more carefully scripted, her famous wit more reliant on preparation than spontaneous brilliance. The elaborate wigs that once crowned her magnificently now serve primarily as concealment for a scalp that has surrendered completely to its tiny tenants. The lice, having established a multi-generational civilization in the royal hairpieces, have achieved a kind of diplomatic immunity. Efforts to evict them have been abandoned in favour of management strategies that focus on containment rather than elimination. Elizabeth's hands, once famous for their delicate beauty and strategic deployment in portraiture, now betray the systematic damage of her beauty regimen. The mercury and arsenic in her cosmetics have left their mark in tremors, discoloration, and a fragility that makes the simple act of holding documents a carefully choreographed performance. Her monthly bathing ritual has devolved into pure theatre. The elaborate preparations continue. The heated water and herbal additives still fill the wooden tub, but Elizabeth's participation has become increasingly ceremonial. She enters the water, sits briefly, and emerges with the relief of someone who has survived an ordeal rather than enjoyed a luxury. The close stool, that faithful companion of royal necessity, now requires assistance for safe navigation. The simple biological functions that were once managed with relative discretion have become complex engineering challenges involving multiple attendants and careful timing. Elizabeth's most private moments have become team efforts in maintaining royal dignity. Her wardrobe has adapted to accommodate her physical decline while maintaining the illusion of regal magnificence. Padding becomes more strategic, designed not just for fashion, but to provide support for a frame that can no longer maintain itself independently. Corsetry grows more elaborate, serving orthopedic functions disguised as aesthetic choice. The aromatic warfare reaches industrial proportions. Guillaume, her perfumer, deploys scents with the desperation of a general facing final defeat. Rose water flows like rivers. Musk accumulates in quantities that would stock a small shop. The air around Elizabeth becomes so saturated with artificial fragrance that breathing in her presence becomes a conscious act of willpower. Her diet adapts to accommodate her deteriorated dental situation and increasingly sensitive digestive system. Foods are pre-processed, pre-chewed by servants, and presented in forms that require minimal oral navigation. Elizabeth's famous appetite becomes a carefully managed medical intervention disguised as royal dining. The paint that creates her public face grows thicker with each passing year. What once required a light application now demands architectural construction. Her ladies-in-waiting become expert in the application of cosmetics to surfaces that barely qualify as human skin anymore. The distinction between makeup and medical treatment disappears entirely. Sleep becomes elusive as the cumulative effects of heavy metal poisoning manifest in neurological symptoms that Tudor medicine cannot understand or treat. Elizabeth spends her nights in restless wakefulness, her days in careful performance of consciousness. The exhaustion shows despite the makeup, the tremors persist despite the medications, the confusion appears despite the careful scripting of her public appearances. Her famous memory, once sharp enough to conduct international diplomacy in multiple languages without notes, begins its slow retreat. She relies increasingly on advisors, not just for counsel, but for the basic recall of facts and figures that once came as naturally as breathing. State papers carry more annotations, meetings require more preparation, decisions take longer to reach as Elizabeth struggles with cognitive processes that mercury and lead have gradually degraded. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of Elizabeth's decline lies in her growing awareness of her condition. The mirrors may be gone from her chambers, but she cannot escape the evidence of her reflection in other people's eyes. The barely concealed relief when audiences end, the careful positioning of courtiers to maintain maximum distance, the way conversations halt when she approaches and resume with artificial enthusiasm when she arrives. Her isolation becomes complete, as even her most trusted attendants begin to treat her more as a managed problem than a beloved monarch. Their loyalty remains absolute, their service impeccable, but the easy familiarity of earlier years disappears beneath the necessity of dealing with Elizabeth's increasingly challenging physical reality. Foreign diplomats, once eager for extended audiences with the brilliant Queen of England, now prefer brief, formal meetings with maximum protocol and minimum personal interaction. Treaties are negotiated through intermediaries. Personal diplomacy gives way to bureaucratic efficiency. Elizabeth's legendary charm becomes a liability, as maintaining it requires more energy than her poisoned system can sustain. Yet she persists, because the alternative, acknowledging the failure of her carefully maintained image, would undermine everything she has built. Each public appearance becomes a triumph of will over reality, mind over deteriorating matter. She continues to rule, to inspire, to terrify her enemies, and reassure her subjects, even as her body surrenders to the accumulated toxins of a lifetime spent in pursuit of artificial perfection. The courtiers around her develop new skills in collective denial. They learn to interpret her increasingly slurred speech, to anticipate her needs before she can articulate them, to maintain the fiction of normal royal function while actually providing comprehensive medical support disguised as traditional service. Elizabeth's final portraits show the ultimate victory of art over reality. The painters, working with the skill of master illusionists, and the desperation of men whose lives depend on customer satisfaction, creates images of a woman who exists only in their collective imagination. These portraits show Elizabeth as ageless, radiant, eternally magnificent, the perfect inverse of the physical reality they're commissioned to disguise. The gap between image and truth becomes so vast that visitors to the court report a kind of cognitive dissonance when meeting the Queen in person after seeing her portraits. They expect the ethereal beauty of painted perfection and encounter instead a carefully maintained theatrical production that requires constant adjustment to maintain believability. As 1603 approaches, Elizabeth's morning preparation routine has evolved into a form of daily resurrection. Her attendants essentially reconstruct her each dawn, applying enough cosmetics to stock a small shop, arranging enough perfume to scent a cathedral, and positioning enough fabric to outfit a travelling circus. The process takes hours and requires the coordinated effort of a dozen specialists working with the precision of a surgical team, but the performance continues because it must. Elizabeth understands that revealing her mortality would be tantamount to abdication. The myth of the Virgin Queen requires eternal youth, divine favour, and supernatural perfection. To appear as a normal, aging, hygienically challenged human being would shatter the entire foundation of her authority. Her final speeches show her awareness of this cosmic joke. When she declares that she has the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too, she's speaking not from a position of strength, but from the desperate necessity of maintaining an illusion that has become more important than the reality it conceals. The end, when it comes, arrives with merciful swiftness. Elizabeth dies not from any single cause, but from the cumulative weight of a lifetime spent in systematic chemical warfare against her own biology. The heavy metals win their final victory. The hygiene failures claim their ultimate prize, and the Virgin Queen surrenders at last to the mortality she spent 70 years denying. Her attendants, faced with preparing her body for viewing, confront the ultimate challenge of their careers. How does one create the illusion of peaceful, dignified death when working with the remains of someone who has spent decades systematically poisoning herself with cosmetics? The answer, it turns out, involves more makeup, more perfume, and more theatrical intervention than any living person ever required. The official death portrait shows Elizabeth in serene repose, her face peaceful and unmarked by time or suffering. The reality beneath the painted facade remains a secret that dies with her attendants, who take their knowledge of the Virgin Queen's final appearance to their own graves rather than compromise the legend they've spent their lives maintaining. And so ends our aromatic journey through the hygienically challenged world of England's greatest queen. Elizabeth Tudor, Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, a woman who conquered Spanish armadas and parliamentary opposition, but could never quite defeat the basic realities of human biology. Her legacy lives on in portraits that show eternal youth, in poetry that celebrates divine beauty, and in history books that politely omit the more pungent details of daily life in Tudor England. She achieved the immortality she sought, though perhaps not in the way she intended. Elizabeth became eternal, not through cleanliness, but through the careful curation of her image, not through divine favour, but through artistic collaboration with reality. The irony is perfect. A queen who feared the mortal implications of bathing achieved immortality through the very substances that slowly killed her. Her painted face gazes down from museum walls across the centuries, beautiful, ageless, and thoroughly toxic, the perfect symbol of an age that valued appearance over health, image over truth, and immediate gratification over long-term survival. In the end, Elizabeth's greatest triumph may be that she managed to rule effectively, despite carrying what amounts to a small chemistry set's worth of heavy metals in her bloodstream. She negotiated treaties while mercury addled her brain, delivered speeches while lead loosened her teeth, and maintained royal dignity while arsenic destroyed her complexion. It's a testament either to her extraordinary willpower or to the human body's disturbing ability to function under chemical assault. Modern visitors to Tudor palaces sometimes report a strange sensation, a feeling that something lingers in the air despite centuries of renovations and cleanings. Perhaps it's just imagination, or maybe it's the ghostly remnant of Elizabeth's aromatic legacy. Rosewater and heavy metals, musk and mortality, the sweet scent of power preserved in chemical amber. Elizabeth achieved everything she sought. She ruled absolutely, she inspired devotion, she defeated her enemies, and she created a legend that has outlasted empires. She just happened to do it all while slowly poisoning herself with makeup and refusing to bathe more than once a month. But then again, in Tudor England, that probably counted as good hygiene. So the next time you see a portrait of good Queen Bess in all her painted glory, remember that you're looking at one of history's most successful chemical experiments, a woman who transformed herself into a living artwork through the careful application of beautiful, deadly substances that would horrify modern toxicologists and probably violate several international treaties. Elizabeth Tudor, Queen, legend, walking Superfund site. Sleep well, dear listeners. And perhaps tomorrow morning, consider yourself fortunate to live in an age where soap is considered safe and bathing doesn't require royal permission. The Virgin Queen rests eternal, preserved in paint and pickled in praise, forever young and forever fragrant in the amber of carefully managed memory. Her hygiene may have been horrific, but her publicity was impeccable. And in the end, isn't that what monarchy is really all about? Sweet dreams? And remember, in Tudor England, even the roses had thorns, and every thorn was probably poisonous. But wait, dear listeners, we cannot close this aromatic tale without acknowledging the true heroes of this malodorous saga, the servants. Behind every carefully maintained royal fiction stands an army of individuals whose job it is to make the impossible appear effortless, the horrifying seem beautiful, and the unbearable appear regal. Elizabeth's personal attendants exist in a state of perpetual cognitive dissonance. They must maintain absolute loyalty to a woman whose very presence challenges their respiratory systems and whose daily care requires the kind of dedication typically reserved for handling hazardous materials. These are the people who know exactly where the bodies are buried, or in this case, exactly where the Queen's various biological functions are managed. The hierarchy of service around Elizabeth develops along olfactory lines. The highest-ranking ladies in waiting, those closest to the throne, both literally and figuratively, possess either the strongest constitutions or the most damaged sense of smell. They've learnt to breathe through their mouths with such consistency that they develop a peculiar speech pattern, a kind of perpetual slight congestion that becomes the accent of royal service. At the pinnacle of this aromatic pyramid sits Blanche Parry, Elizabeth's longest-serving attendant, a woman whose dedication to the Queen spans decades, and whose nostrils have presumably died in service to the crown. Blanche has witnessed Elizabeth's transformation from vibrant young princess to chemically preserved monument to royal vanity. She alone knows the full scope of the morning reconstruction process, the exact quantity of perfume required to achieve basic social acceptability, and the precise timing needed to maintain the illusion of royal perfection. Blanche's daily routine reads like a military operation. She rises at 4 in the morning to begin heating water, mixing cosmetics, and preparing the aromatic arsenal that will transform Elizabeth from nocturnal reality into diurnal myth. Her rooms adjacent to the royal chambers contain enough beauty supplies to stock a small apothecary and enough cleaning materials to sanitize a plague ward. The communication system among Elizabeth's attendants operates through a complex network of signals, codes, and euphemisms that would impress intelligence operatives. They cannot speak directly about the Queen's condition. Such honesty would constitute treason, but they must coordinate their efforts to maintain the royal fiction. They develop a vocabulary of subtle gestures and meaningful glances that allows them to share vital information without explicitly acknowledging what everyone knows. Her Majesty requires additional morning preparations. Translates to, the smell is particularly challenging today. The royal chambers need extra attention, means something has gone catastrophically wrong with the hygiene situation. Her Majesty prefers private dining this evening, indicates no one should get within breathing distance of the Queen until further notice. The servant quarters become a kind of support group for individuals traumatized by prolonged exposure to royal reality. New attendants undergo a breaking-in period during which their colleagues monitor them for signs of respiratory distress, olfactory shock, or the kind of hysterical laughter that indicates complete psychological breakdown. Those who survived the first month developed the 1,000-yard stare common among combat veterans and hazmat technicians. The economic impact of maintaining Elizabeth's hygiene fiction extends far beyond the obvious costs of cosmetics and perfumes. The palace staff turnover rate in positions requiring close contact with the Queen approaches wartime casualties. Recruiting new attendants becomes an ongoing challenge that requires careful vetting for strong stomachs, weak senses of smell, and absolute discretion. The servants develop specialized skills that would serve them well in modern disaster management. They learn to work efficiently in contaminated environments, to maintain professional composure under extreme olfactory assault, and to coordinate complex operations while breathing through improvised filtration systems. Many begin carrying small sachets of aromatic herbs, ostensibly for personal fragrance, but actually as emergency respiratory protection. Elizabeth's body servants, those unfortunate souls responsible for her most intimate care, occupy a special category of royal employment that might charitably be called hazard duty. They receive additional compensation, not officially, for the obvious reasons, but for their exceptional dedication to royal service. The turnover in these positions is so rapid that the palace maintains a waiting list of candidates, many of whom withdraw their applications after speaking with former employees. The laundresses who handle Elizabeth's undergarments work under conditions that would challenge modern industrial safety standards. The daily washing of the Queen's shifts, stockings, and other intimate apparel requires special protocols that include extended boiling times, multiple rinse cycles, and the liberal use of strong soaps that strip both stains and skin. These women develop their own occupational hazards, respiratory problems from the steam and chemicals, skin conditions from handling contaminated fabrics, and a peculiar form of professional PTSD. The chamber pots used by Elizabeth require a specialized disposal team that operates with military precision and military-grade protective equipment, or at least the Tudor equivalent thereof. These individuals, working under cover of darkness and sworn to silence, transport the royal waste through predetermined routes that avoid populated areas of the palace. They've developed techniques for minimizing exposure that would impress modern sewage workers, but perhaps the most challenging position in Elizabeth's household belongs to her tasters, those individuals responsible for testing her food before she consumes it. This job, traditionally focused on detecting poison, acquires new dimensions when the person being protected has such compromised oral hygiene that determining what constitutes normal flavor becomes impossible. These brave souls must distinguish between the taste of actual poison and the taste of food that has been contaminated by proximity to Elizabeth's mouth. The palace physicians occupy their own special circle of professional hell. They must treat a patient whose symptoms they cannot openly discuss, whose condition they cannot accurately diagnose, and whose cooperation they cannot expect. Elizabeth's doctors learn to work around her vanity, her denial, and her fundamental unwillingness to acknowledge that her beauty regimen might be contributing to her health problems. These medical professionals develop their own coded language for discussing Elizabeth's condition. Royal complexion concerns refers to the obvious lead poisoning. Digestive sensitivities describes the gastrointestinal effects of mercury consumption. Occasional respiratory challenges means the Queen's breath could stop a charging horse. They prescribe treatments that must work around, rather than address, the root causes of Elizabeth's problems. The palace guards face unique challenges when protecting a monarch whose very presence can clear a room. They must maintain security protocols while dealing with their own physical reactions to prolonged exposure to Elizabeth's atmospheric conditions. Guard duty in the royal quarters becomes a form of endurance test that separates the truly dedicated from those who value their sense of smell. Diplomatic protocol officers earn their pay, managing the complex logistics of foreign visits, when the Queen they're protecting might constitute a biological hazard to international relations. They develop elaborate strategies for managing audience lengths, seating arrangements, and ventilation systems that ensure visiting dignitaries can complete their missions without requiring medical attention. The artists commissioned to paint Elizabeth's portraits face perhaps the most creatively challenging assignment in Renaissance art. They must capture the essence of divine monarchy while working with a subject whose actual appearance would challenge the most diplomatic brush. These painters learn to work quickly, to position themselves at strategic distances, and to rely heavily on preliminary sketches that minimize the time required for live observation. Portrait sessions become elaborate productions involving multiple attendants, whose job is to maintain Elizabeth's presentation throughout the sitting. Fans are deployed not for cooling, but for air circulation. Incense burns not for religious purposes, but for atmospheric management. The final paintings show not what the artists saw, but what they diplomatically chose to interpret from their brief, carefully managed exposures to royal reality. Unlike the palace, musicians face their own acoustic challenges when performing for a queen whose presence affects their ability to breathe properly. They learn to play with reduced lung capacity, to position themselves strategically in relation to air currents, and to choose repertoires that accommodate the respiratory limitations imposed by their working environment. Even the palace chaplains must adapt their services to accommodate Elizabeth's hygiene challenges. Prayers become shorter, blessings more efficient, and religious ceremonies more carefully ventilated. The Queen's private chapel requires special architectural considerations that ensure adequate air circulation while maintaining the dignity appropriate to royal worship. The servants' ultimate loyalty lies not in their ability to ignore Elizabeth's condition, but in their commitment to protecting her dignity despite it. They become guardians of royal mythology, maintaining the fiction that allows Elizabeth to function as an effective monarch, while privately managing the reality that would destroy her public image. Their discretion outlasts their service. Former attendants carry their knowledge to the grave, rather than compromise the legend they helped create. The servants' quarters become repositories of state secrets, more closely guarded than military intelligence. These individuals understand that they possess information that could topple dynasties and reshape history. When Elizabeth dies, her servants face the ultimate test of their loyalty. They must prepare her body for public viewing while maintaining one final time the illusion of royal perfection. The process requires all their accumulated skills, the cosmetic expertise, the aromatic management, the careful positioning that conceals while revealing. Their final service to Elizabeth is to ensure that she appears in death as she insisted on appearing in life, untouched by the mortal concerns that actually shaped her existence. The servants' unwritten histories contain the real story of Elizabeth's reign, not the sanitized version that appears in official chronicles, but the daily reality of maintaining monarchy through collective denial, professional discretion, and personal sacrifice. They understand that they've served not just a queen, but a collaborative fiction that required their complicity to survive. In the end, Elizabeth's servants may be the true heroes of her story. They enabled one of history's most effective monarchs to rule, despite hygiene challenges that would have defeated lesser individuals. They proved that loyalty, properly applied, can overcome even the most challenging atmospheric conditions. Their reward was not fame or recognition, but the satisfaction of having preserved something greater than themselves, the idea that monarchy can transcend the base realities of human biology. They helped create a legend that outlasted the woman who inspired it, a myth that survived the truth that threatened to destroy it. Elizabeth's crown may have been heavy, but her servants' burden was heavier still. They carried the weight of royal reality while maintaining the lightness of royal fiction. They served not just a queen, but an idea, not just a person, but a principle. And if the roses in palace gardens bloomed with unusual vigour during Elizabeth's reign, it may have had less to do with royal favour than with the exceptionally rich fertiliser that her servants so discreetly provided. Their service was truly the foundation upon which the Elizabethan age was built. Literally, in some cases. Sweet dreams. And remember, behind every great monarch stands an army of people whose job it is to make greatness possible, no matter what it costs their sinuses. But our tale would be incomplete without examining how Elizabeth's hygiene challenges affected England's international relations. Diplomacy, after all, is fundamentally about personal interaction, and when one of the key participants in these interactions presents certain atmospheric challenges, the entire delicate machinery of international relations must adapt accordingly. Foreign ambassadors arriving at Elizabeth's court face briefings that would bewilder modern diplomatic protocols. They're instructed in the proper distances to maintain during audiences, the optimal breathing techniques for extended conversations, and the subtle art of conducting meaningful negotiations while preventing their eyes from watering. These diplomatic veterans, accustomed to navigating treacherous political waters, find themselves instead learning to navigate treacherous aromatic conditions. The Spanish ambassador, Don Bernardino de Mendoza, provides perhaps the most detailed contemporary account of the challenges facing foreign diplomats in Elizabeth's presence. His letters to Philip II describe audiences that begin with optimism and end with barely concealed relief. He develops a diplomatic strategy based on efficiency rather than charm, conducting business with the kind of brisk professionalism typically reserved for discussing plague outbreaks. Don Bernardino's correspondence reveals the creative solutions required for effective diplomacy under these conditions. He begins carrying scented handkerchiefs, not as fashion accessories, but as essential diplomatic equipment. His audiences with Elizabeth are scheduled for early morning, when the Queen's aromatic defences are at their peak effectiveness. He learns to position himself near windows, ostensibly to better appreciate the English countryside, but actually to ensure adequate ventilation. The French embassy faces its own unique challenges, particularly given France's reputation for sophisticated personal hygiene. Ambassador Michel de Castelnau arrives at Elizabeth's court with expectations based on Parisian standards and finds himself confronting what can only be described as a cultural shock of the most personal kind. His dispatches to Catherine de' Medici become increasingly focused on atmospheric conditions rather than political negotiations. De Castelnau develops what becomes known in diplomatic circles as the English Protocol, a system of brief, focused meetings that accomplish maximum political business in minimum exposure time. He pioneers the use of intermediaries for extended discussions, claiming this approach shows proper respect for royal dignity while actually protecting his own respiratory system. The Venetian ambassador, Giovanni Michiel, brings a merchant's practical approach to the challenge. Venice, built on water and waste, has prepared him for unusual atmospheric conditions, but even his experience proves inadequate for the realities of Elizabeth's court. His reports to the Doge read like technical manuals for surviving hostile environments rather than traditional diplomatic correspondence. Michiel's innovation lies in his development of what he calls atmospheric intelligence, detailed reports on the optimal timing for various types of negotiations based on Elizabeth's daily routine, the weather conditions that affect palace ventilation, and the seasonal variations in royal hygiene effectiveness. His successors use these reports, like military intelligence, planning their diplomatic campaigns around environmental rather than political factors. The Holy Roman Empire's representatives face additional challenges, given their empire's formal protocol requirements. Extended ceremonial presentations become endurance tests that challenge even the most dedicated diplomats. Ambassador Ruprecht von Eitzing develops a reputation for remarkable stamina that has less to do with political dedication than with superior breath control techniques learned from alpine mountain climbing. Von Eitzing's reports to Emperor Rudolf II reveal the development of specialized diplomatic equipment that would confuse modern historians. References to aromatic armor, defensive herbs, and tactical positioning make sense only when viewed through the lens of Elizabeth's hygiene challenges. His embassy becomes a case study in adapting formal protocol to informal biological realities. The papal nuncios face perhaps the most delicate challenge, given the religious tensions already complicating their missions. They must maintain proper diplomatic respect for Elizabeth's person, while privately questioning whether her condition might represent divine commentary on her spiritual state. Their reports to Rome carefully avoid explicit descriptions, while making oblique references that Vatican theologians spend considerable time interpreting. Monsignor Giovanni Battista Castagna develops what becomes known as the brevity doctrine for papal diplomacy with Protestant England. His audiences with Elizabeth become models of efficient communication, accomplishing in minutes what traditionally required hours. The Vatican initially interprets this efficiency as evidence of divine favour for rapid conversion of England. The reality proves somewhat more prosaic. These diplomatic adaptations create their own international incidents. Foreign courts begin to suspect that England's diplomatic protocols conceal political rather than practical motivations. The brief audience times are interpreted as evidence of English arrogance. The emphasis on written rather than verbal communication suggests distrust of foreign representatives. Elizabeth's own diplomatic correspondence reflects her awareness of these challenges. Her letters to foreign monarchs become longer and more detailed, compensating for the brevity of personal meetings with extended written explanations. She develops an epistolary charm that replaces the personal magnetism that atmospheric conditions make increasingly difficult to deploy. The marriage negotiations that define much of Elizabeth's reign take on tragic comic dimensions when viewed through this lens. Foreign princes arriving to court the Virgin Queen find themselves conducting romance through intermediaries, expressing passion across carefully maintained distances, and declaring love while breathing through aromatic handkerchiefs. The Archduke Charles of Austria's courtship becomes a masterpiece of long-distance romance, with the actual distance carefully calculated to optimize both political appeal and respiratory comfort. His representatives report that the Archduke finds Elizabeth radiant from afar, a diplomatic phrasing that would prove prophetic. Eric XIV of Sweden's marriage proposal is conducted almost entirely through correspondence, with personal meetings limited to brief ceremonial encounters that leave both parties relieved rather than romantically inspired. The Swedish delegation's reports describe Elizabeth's otherworldly presence in terms that suggest transcendence of mortal concerns rather than romantic attraction. The Duke of Anjou's extended courtship provides perhaps the most detailed documentation of how Elizabeth's condition affects international relations. French records describe a gradual shift from passionate pursuit to diplomatic efficiency as the reality of extended personal contact becomes apparent. The famous frog nickname takes on new meaning when understood as a reference to amphibious breathing techniques rather than appearance. These diplomatic challenges force innovations in international protocol that outlast Elizabeth's reign. The emphasis on written communication, the preference for brief formal meetings, and the use of intermediaries for extended negotiations become standard features of English diplomacy that historians attribute to national character rather than practical necessity. Trade negotiations face similar adaptations. Merchant representatives conducting business with England learn to prepare for atmospheric challenges that affect their ability to concentrate on complex commercial details. The famous efficiency of English business practices may owe more to practical constraints than to cultural preference for brevity. Military alliances require special consideration when they involve Elizabeth's personal participation in ceremonial functions. The famous Tilbury speech, delivered to troops preparing to face the Spanish Armada, becomes a masterpiece of crowd management as much as oratory. Elizabeth's positioning on horseback creates optimal distance for both dramatic effect and atmospheric management. Even routine diplomatic gift exchanges required adaptation. Foreign courts learn to present offerings that can be appreciated from a distance rather than examined closely. Elizabeth's famous collection of jewels reflects not just royal vanity, but practical appreciation for gifts that sparkle from afar rather than requiring intimate inspection. The long-term consequences of these diplomatic adaptations shape England's international relationships for generations. Foreign courts develop expectations of English efficiency, brevity, and preference for written over personal communication that become defining characteristics of English diplomatic style. Elizabeth's legacy in international relations thus includes not just her political achievements, but her inadvertent contribution to diplomatic evolution. She forces the development of more efficient, practical approaches to international negotiation that emphasize substance over ceremony, results over relationship, and achievement over affection. In the end, Elizabeth's hygiene challenges may have improved English diplomacy by eliminating the social pleasantries that typically obscure serious political business. Foreign representatives, eager to conclude their missions and return to breathable air, focus on essential issues rather than diplomatic small talk. Her reign proves that effective international relations depend less on personal charm than on clear communication, practical solutions, and mutual understanding, even when that understanding includes the tacit agreement that some things are better left unspoken. The Virgin Queen's diplomatic legacy thus includes both the expansion of English influence and the evolution of more efficient diplomatic practices. She conquered through compromise, achieved through adaptation, and succeeded by transforming practical limitations into procedural innovations. Elizabeth's international relations prove that even the most personal challenges can be overcome through creative problem-solving, professional discretion, and the diplomatic equivalent of very good ventilation. Her empire was built not just on naval power and economic strength, but on the collective willingness of international diplomacy to pretend that some atmospheric conditions simply didn't exist. And sometimes, dear listeners, the most effective diplomacy is the kind that achieves its goals, while everyone involved agrees to ignore the obvious. Sweet dreams. And remember, in international relations, as in life, sometimes the most important conversations are the ones nobody talks about.